Let's get on to our main item for tonight, straight into this. And this is about a guy called Peter Daszak. He's a Brit who was working very closely with Dr. Fauci in order to do gain-of-function research. And when President Obama banned it in the United States, he didn't really seem to think it was for him, this banning, Peter Daszak. And he marched over, or got on a plane or a ship, or God knows what. But anyway, he went over to Wuhan and he found a nice little virology institute there where he could carry on with his gain-of-function research. But I thought we'd start tonight by going back almost a year to March 2020, a program called the Mary Harris show called What Next, with Peter Daszak here. Daszak? Not quite sure how to pronounce it. Maybe we'll hear now. Where she says, he saw the coronavirus coming. So that is, just to put this in context, this is her also talking about this program that she recorded back in March 2020, but talking about it more recently, I think over Christmas time, saying, well, hang on, we did this program back in March. Isn't it interesting? This is the guy that saw coronavirus coming, Peter Daszak.
When did you first hear about what was happening in Wuhan with this outbreak?
Oh, I know exactly when. It was New Year's Eve. It was during the day.
This is Peter Daszak. He's a zoologist, lives in New York, works in China.
We were following rumors on the internet in China about this outbreak, and I got these translated internet sites that were saying not only is it a new virus, it's a coronavirus. So I think people knew back then. You know, the minute we got the sequence that was released, we quickly matched that up and showed that it was a bat virus. And not only that, it's very close to the group we've been working on. So, you know, your emotion then is excitement in a way, because this is exactly what you've been saying is going to happen, and then fear that our lives are going to be, you know, turned upside down and people are going to die, which is exactly what's happening right now.
If you were looking at this coronavirus outbreak and seeing a game of whack-a-mole with doctors all around the world urgently trying to quash this virus, Peter, he sees it differently. He sees a game of chess with patterns and predictability. A few years back, Peter was working with the World Health Organization, plotting out what the next global pandemic could look like, when he and some other scientists came up with the idea of Disease X. Disease X would hit this kind of epidemiological sweet spot. It would transmit easily from person to person. It would be deadly, but not too deadly.
So it's going to be a disease that's slightly more fatal than flu. It's going to be a disease that spreads through global air travel. It's going to be a disease with kind of hidden symptoms early on that maybe mimic another disease that we're used to, so we don't go and get tested.
This sounds just like COVID.
Yeah, it's exactly like COVID-19. And that's exactly the scenario we were getting ready for.
But even though doctors like Peter knew this virus was coming, he says, we didn't get ready. Not soon enough. I was listening to some experts talk about COVID, and they were referring to it as a black swan. They were saying, which is, of course, this phrase, it means an unexpected event that couldn't be anticipated.
Wrong. Yeah, that really kind of, you know, there's a lot of this black swan talk out there. These are not black swan events. We've been talking about them for 15 years and saying not only are pandemics increasing in frequency, we're going to get more of them more often. They're getting bigger. China is right in the middle of a coronavirus hotspot. That's why we were there for 15 years working on these viruses.
Today on the show, Peter says even when this outbreak is contained, it's not going to be the last. But if we pay close attention to what's happening right now, next time, it could be different. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick with us.
Yeah, so that's Mary Harris talking to Peter Daszak. Martin, he's there right at the beginning of all of this saying, oh, well, we told you something like this might happen. Well, he's actually studying these viruses specifically himself there at the Virology Institute in Wuhan with his gain-of-function research. So you have to ask the question, is he actually part of the problem, or is he actually trying to sort things out?
I think that's a very good question. Most people do not realize that there was people like him operating through the Wuhan virology laboratory, and stuff I've seen suggests that they found a bat virus in southern China, which had killed several people who were working digging bat guano out of a cave. Because they were basically, they were digging it for several days. They got lots of the dust in their lungs and they all got a new disease. And people from the Virology Institute went down there to get the blood samples from the people who died. And of course, what he's talking about is what we've been doing, what they were doing in the US and then continuing to do in China, was get hold of viruses from the environment and then push them through like ferrets, for example, so that you keep modifying them so that they then become more transmissible. So then you can develop vaccines so as nature itself would possibly develop this, but you accelerate nature so that you can then develop vaccines against what you've been developing. Now, of course, another word for that is actually biological warfare development. And that's possibly what's going on here. And, of course, it's a bit of a giveaway when he says it will be easily transmissible, but it won't have immediate symptoms. It won't kill loads of people. Don't forget, a biological warfare attack isn't necessarily designed to kill everybody. What you want to do, if it's a deliberate attack, is you're trying to wreck the Chinese economy just as it overtakes the US economy, which is exactly what was happening this time last year. And therefore, there is circumstantial evidence that is what has happened here.
Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, so let's go now to the report by CNN, which was looking here at Peter Daszak and his actual activities over in Wuhan over the last few weeks. And here he actually interviews Peter Daszak, and this is just before we had the report from Fox News from Steve Hilton. So I'm trying to put this in a kind of chronological order, because CNN were absolutely on the case, saying, well, this guy, he's the US representative on the World Health Organization. Even though he's a Brit, he's the US representative on the World Health Organization's investigation a year after the outbreak in Wuhan itself. So let's have a listen to the CNN report. And the reporter here is David Culver.
A team of experts from the WHO on the ground in Wuhan this hour, and they have been there for a week. They're looking for clues as to where exactly the virus came from. Why? Well, to make sure this never happens again. As for what the team will find, well, in large part, that depends on how much China lets them poke around. Well, our David Culver has been living this story in China for a year. David, of course, made it out of Wuhan a year ago, just before the lockdown, joining us tonight from Shanghai. David, what have you learned?
A caravan of vehicles pulling into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. On board, international experts representing the World Health Organization. Their mission? To find the origin of COVID-19.
What we're trying to do right now at this stage is keep an open mind about every possibility.
CNN connected with zoologist Peter Daszak. He's part of the source tracing assignment here in China. Speaking to us from his hotel room in Wuhan, he had just visited the Virology Institute's highly secured and highly controversial lab. It is from here that former U.S. President Donald Trump and his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have alleged the virus originated.
I think they made a horrible mistake, and they didn't want to admit it.
China has rejected the claim.
It was good to see the lab, and you confirmed your suspicions that it's an incredibly well built, well-designed, well-managed lab.
Members of the scientific community have said that Daszak has a conflict of interest due to his close ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its leading scientist, Xizheng Li. This video, shot in 2014, shows the pair inside the institute examining coronavirus samples collected from bats. They've jointly published several scientific research papers.
She speaks very openly and quite directly, and often goes counter to this sort of political trend.
Xizheng Li is known as Batwoman in China. She's reached celebrity status. Since the SARS outbreak in 2003, she has focused her research on bats and the various coronaviruses they carry. But after COVID-19 was first detected in Wuhan, less than 10 miles from where her lab is located, speculation surfaced that the virus leaked from her facility.
I've seen evidence that this likely came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
The Trump administration provided no evidence to support those claims.
Do you think it's possible this virus was engineered within that lab and leaked?
There's no evidence of that at all. But it is something that we talked about with people at the Wuhan lab and got really honest and frank and good, informative answers to. Because they themselves brought this up. Conspiracies around lab leaks that they feel strongly have no grounds.
Conspiracists, he calls us. Peter Daszak there, Martin, even CNN are saying that the scientific community says he's got a conflict of interest. He's been over in Wuhan, China, looking into COVID, and yet he's actually pals with all the main people at the Virology Institute there.
Yeah, well, I think we've got to logically unpack this step by step. It may have come from that laboratory. It may have come from Fort Detrick in Maryland. It may genuinely be a natural phenomenon. I don't tend to that view because they haven't been able to explain how it would become such a complex virus so quickly. It would have to go through several mutations in other animals.
Well, I mean, the main point, Martin, you've not addressed there, which is Peter Daszak has been working with the people at the Wuhan Institute for many, many years, and he's not appropriate to be sending him over there to investigate them, surely.
Well, it depends what the goal of the investigation is. I think the Chinese intelligence services are probably aware that this was a deliberate leak from their laboratory in order to wreck their economy. Which is why they locked down, they kept it under wraps and then locked everything down as quickly as they could because they were aware that it was going to be dangerous. But of course, it's not in the interests either of the Chinese or of the intelligence services in the West to admit what's actually happened here. And of course, when Trump and Pompeo are trying to pin the blame on the Wuhan laboratory, MI6 and various other people, spokespersons of that ilk were poo-pooing it because they probably know what did happen and that it was a deliberate attempt to wreck the Chinese economy and then flow back over the US so that they could bail the banks out because the banks collapsed in September of 2019. That only came out subsequently. And I think if you think about what we know as conspiracy theorists, if that's what we are, about 9/11, about Gladio, about what Western intelligence services really do, then it doesn't become at all incredible that they would try and wreck the Chinese economy at this stage using the virology labs as a vector, or it may have been to do with the military games that took place sometime before the outbreak was supposedly identified.
A month or so beforehand, yeah. Anyway, so let's have a listen now to Steve Hilton's report. This is the 15 minutes long, but he goes into some incredible detail on his Fox News programme, 31st of January this year, looking into detail at what was going on and why was this gain-of-function research transferred to Wuhan, and who was actually behind it? Who were the individuals that decided to carry on with that research once it was banned for very obvious reasons, that this is basically biological warfare research, and it's banned under international treaties. It had been banned in the United States by President Obama, and yet people like Dr. Fauci and good old Peter Daszak decided we're going to have to carry on with this anyway, and we're going to find somewhere else to do it. So up yours, Obama. So this is Steve Hilton's report on Fox News on 31st of January. It's about 15 minutes long, but he goes into the real nitty-gritty detail. Fantastic job Steve's done here, looking at the gain-of-function research, which so many people have condemned, including Nature magazine, if they dare, as an absolutely insane thing to be doing, to trying to make viruses go between various species, bats, pangolins, God knows what else, and human beings in order to make them far more dangerous.
Welcome back. Let's get straight to tonight's special investigation. The coronavirus pandemic is one of the most destructive events in the history of the world. The virus itself, of course, but also the lockdowns, championed here by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's now been given even more power by President Biden. Here was Fauci last week.
I am honored to announce that the United States will remain a member of the World Health Organization. Yesterday, President Biden signed letters retracting the previous administration's announcement to withdraw from the organization. And those letters have been transmitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations and to you, Dr. Tedros, my dear friend.
Seems to us that after the facts we're about to lay out for you, Dr. Fauci is going to need dear friends in high places. In the next few minutes, you'll see the evidence that points to the most likely cause of the pandemic, and it is worse than anything you've heard so far. The story starts with one of the pandemic's more surprising side effects. You may have heard late last year that Denmark decided to cull its entire population of mink. Here in America, a mink in Utah was the first wild animal found to have the virus. So what is it with the mink? Well, it turns out that mink and related animals have respiratory systems that operate similarly to humans. That's why about 10 years ago, researchers at Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands embarked on a series of experiments involving ferrets. They were trying to see if a virus that starts off without the ability to be transmitted through the air can eventually gain that ability. The answer was yes. They discovered that by injecting an influenza virus from one ferret to another until the virus mutated enough to be transmitted through the air by aerosol droplets. This led to the creation of an entirely new type of scientific research made possible by advances in gene technology or genomics. It was called gain-of-function virus research. The idea was to replicate in a lab what had been done with those ferrets, to take a virus and then manipulate its genetic code to make it stronger and more powerful. The virus would gain new functions, hence the name. Gain-of-function virus research, for some, showed huge promise. If we could engineer the most contagious, deadly viruses ourselves in lab conditions, we could learn about potential treatments and vaccines without the calamity of an actual outbreak. The driving principle of gain-of-function research was a noble one. Know your enemy so you can better prepare to fight it. Over the years, gain-of-function virus research has been carried out all over the world with funding from our own National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. And one of the leading laboratories in gain-of-function research was based in China. It's a place the world has come to know well, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But as well as having great potential to help mankind, gain-of-function research could also hurt us. Imagine if a deadly virus engineered in the lab to be incredibly contagious somehow escaped from the lab. It could wreak havoc precisely because it was designed to do that, not by nature, but by us. For this reason, gain-of-function research has always been highly controversial. In fact, in 2014, the Obama administration went so far as to place a complete moratorium on this kind of research, quote, following recent biosafety incidents at federal research facilities. Here's what they said at the time. The funding pause will apply to gain-of-function research projects that may be reasonably anticipated to confer attributes to influenza, MERS, or SARS viruses, such that the virus would have enhanced pathogenicity and or transmissibility in mammals via the respiratory route. Now, despite the controversy surrounding this type of research, it always had one steadfast champion, a leading figure in the world of infectious diseases, Anthony Fauci. His institute funded that first ferret study. At the time, he co-wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post describing this research as, quote, a risk worth taking. Important information and insights can come from generating a potentially dangerous virus in the laboratory. And shortly before the Obama administration's ban on gain-of-function research in 2014, Fauci commissioned this. It was a project to assess the risk of new coronaviruses emerging from wild animals, like bats. One of its stated aims was to see what viruses can infect both animals and humans. Now pay close attention to these words right at the end of the project summary. Predictive models of host range, i.e. emergence potential, will be tested experimentally using reverse genetics, pseudovirus and receptor binding assays, and virus infection experiments across a range of cell cultures from different species and humanized mice. That is a description of viral gain-of-function research, the exact type of research that the Obama administration stopped. But Fauci didn't stop it. he continued on by subcontracting it to this group, EcoHealth Alliance, based in New York. It's run by a big name in the field of virus research, Peter Daszak. He's a zoologist who specializes in wildlife diseases. His claim to fame, and it's a big one, is that he was the person who first discovered the bat origin of the SARS pandemic just over a decade ago. Daszak established that the virus came from bats via a civet cat in a Chinese market. Ever since then, Daszak developed a reputation as the Batman. He and his team would literally go to remote jungle caves to collect bat samples for scientific research. The project that Fauci commissioned gave EcoHealth Alliance more than $3 million over the course of 6 years, despite the Obama administration's ban. And here we come to the crucial step, which has never before been reported. Peter Daszak himself subcontracted a key piece of the Fauci project, the gain-of-function piece. He gave that to a well-known center of expertise in gain-of-function virus research, which specialized in bat coronaviruses. Yep, he gave it to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The question is, did they give it to us? Let's see what they did with the Fauci money. In the project's results page, there are 13 papers co-authored by Shi Zhengli, who is head of the Wuhan Institute's infectious disease unit. One of the papers was published in 2017, roughly halfway through the project. Peter Daszak is listed as a co-author. It's a kind of progress report. Inside the funding section of that paper is the ID of the Fauci Commission project. That's the money trail. Until now, the only reporting on Fauci's role in all this has been on his funding of the Wuhan lab in general. But tonight we can go further. Thanks to this paper, we can see the specific activity that Fauci funded. And it's terrifying. So terrifying, in fact, that after we reached out to the NIH and Peter Daszak's group for comment, this paper was mysteriously taken offline on Friday for a while. But we downloaded it weeks ago. Here are the details. We're putting the actual scientific language on screen now, but this is what it means in plain English. They collected samples of bat feces from a cave near Kunming in Yunnan province, China. They found many novel bat coronaviruses in the feces. They analyzed them and sequenced their genetic information. They then built various chimeras, genetically engineered new viruses, man-made, in the lab. They infected human cells with them in the lab. And they then showed that their man-made viruses could replicate as a functional virus. Here's the most important part. The genetic changes they made in the lab unlocked a highly specific doorway into the human body. The virus that causes COVID-19 uses that same exact doorway. To be clear, none of the genetically engineered viruses created back in 2017 and reported in this paper were the exact ones we're dealing with now. But what they confirm is that it was possible to make the COVID-19 virus using the techniques developed in the Fauci project. And that project continued for 3 more years. 3 more years of experimentation, 3 more years of man-made mutation. Now let's look at the actual COVID-19 virus. How does it compare to the ones we know were made earlier in the Wuhan lab? The actual pandemic virus was found to stick to human cells 10 to 20 times tighter than the original SARS virus, which is why it's much more infectious. Scientists would expect increases in infectiousness to happen through cycles of mutation, but with this virus, it was there from the start. In a paper published in February 2020, Shi Zhengli confirms that the backbone of the pandemic virus matches one from the Wuhan Institute's library of collected samples. Their 2017 paper describes how they swapped parts of coronavirus found in other animals into bat coronavirus strains in order to make more infectious man-made versions. And sure enough, the pandemic virus looks like a combination of 2 very different bat viruses mixed with parts of a virus from a completely different species. Could something like that occur in nature? That's what Peter Daszak is saying. Quote, maybe a farmer got infected or a farmer's animals and they were shipped into their markets. If a person brings it in or an animal, that virus will spread. And it looks like that's what happened here. If we're to believe that natural origin story, here are the coincidences that would have had to happen. Multiple different species of bats in South China would have to infect each other and some other unknown animal. then either these animals or an infected human would need to have traveled 1,000 miles without infecting anyone until they got to Wuhan. In its first incarnation, before any mutations, it would have been 10 to 20 times more infectious than any previously observed virus. And most incredibly of all, the infected animal or human would have somehow chosen to make their 1,000-mile trek to the only place in all of China with a lab that had the world's most extensive collection of the viruses it was already infected with, and the one place in the entire world that carried out genetic research which matched that virus. We're not suggesting for a second that the coronavirus was created or released as a bioweapon, but lab accidents happen. That is literally the reason the Obama administration stopped this kind of research. During the SARS epidemic, 2 researchers studying that virus in a lab in China became infected and sparked an outbreak. Another researcher in Singapore was infected with SARS, and he wasn't even studying it. Other people in his lab were. Even with the proper precautions, these leaks can happen. The researcher in Singapore was working in a lab with a biosafety level 3 rating, the second highest possible. A lab with a biosafety rating of 4 was built in the Wuhan Institute in 2015, but they'd been doing bat coronavirus research years before then, in less safe settings, and even after the higher safety rating, there were concerns about it. In 2018, the US Embassy in China repeatedly sent diplomats to the lab, who after touring it warned that it had serious safety and management weaknesses. And just last week, the State Department said that several researchers at the lab became sick in the fall of 2019 with COVID symptoms. It was also reported in January that Matt Pottinger, President Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor, privately told a group of British officials that a, quote, growing body of evidence supported the idea that the virus leaked from the Wuhan lab. Here, on the record, is Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, the UK's CIA. Quote, it's an engineered escapee from the Wuhan Institute. I'm not saying anything other than the fact that it was the result of an accident. These obvious lab risks are why the Obama administration tried to stop this research back in 2014. When you modify a bat virus to the point where it can spread from human to human through the air, you're playing with fire. The Trump administration cut funding for this research last year. Why on earth didn't Fauci stop it as soon as the Obama moratorium was announced back in 2014? For nearly a year, scientists and reporters have been digging into the lab origin theory, most notably Alina Chan from the Broad Institute, Ian Birrell in the Daily Mail, and Nicholson Baker in New York Magazine. The response from the medical establishment has been shocking. Instead of trying to find out what actually happened, they've been pushing a cover-up. In February 2020, Peter Daszak organized an open letter in The Lancet, trashing the lab origin theory. In February! How could they possibly know? There'd been no investigation, nothing. Then in November last year, he was made the chief of an international task force investigating the virus's origins. It's a laughable conflict of interest. He's even on the WHO investigation team that arrived in China on the 13th, an investigation which, unbelievably, has no plans to investigate the lab leak theory. This establishment cover-up tells us something. Why are they so desperate to rule out the most likely explanation without even investigating it? Because that would embarrass the 2 most powerful governments in the world. The Chinese government, whose lab in Wuhan may have allowed the virus to leak. And worse still, our own government, which, based on the evidence we have laid out tonight, in 2014 commissioned the research that produced this virus in the first place. This week, President Biden made Fauci his chief medical advisor with an enhanced role. In the light of the documents and the evidence we've presented tonight, that role is completely untenable. Fauci must step aside until we get to the bottom of his role in creating, unintentionally of course, this catastrophic global pandemic. We need to know why he didn't stop funding this research after the Obama administration's ban. And most important of all, are we still funding this research, which could potentially lead to another pandemic? Here's Dr. Fauci talking to Rachel Maddow this week.
I think you're going to see a lot of transparency. You know, you might not see everybody as often as you want, but you're not going to see deliberate holding back of good people when the press asks for them.
Well, we did ask for him. Seems he only likes to talk to people who fawn all over him. We reached out to Fauci, the NIH, and Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance for comment and got back nothing in return. If you want to see the documents for yourself, you can. We'll share all the links. Just follow us at Steve Hilton X and at NextRevFNC.
So that's a Steve Hilton report that I tried to download last Thursday, found that it had just disappeared. And actually, because I hadn't kept a note of it, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. It had been taken off of YouTube. And now we know why, Martin, don't we? Because this is actually pretty explosive, what Fox has put together here. And I suppose the main thing here is this enormous great conflict of interest, particularly with Peter Daszak, using effectively diversionary tactics at the World Health Organization's investigation to go looking down, bat caves and God knows what, but not to be looking at him and his own colleagues having created this Chimera virus, which, as we heard in the report there, quite clearly infected people at the Wuhan lab, and it looks like now that's possibly the source of all of this pain. But incredible to put the person who is the highest chief suspect of the crime in charge of investigating it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting report, and the fact that it's been suppressed suggests that they're barking up the right tree, doesn't it? But of course, where I would possibly disagree with him is he's saying that it's not deliberate. And of course, the Chinese, if they had done it, would be in a position to say, well, we're sorry about this, but it was an accident, but you were involved in this as well, so let's just hush it up, which is basically what the official story is, both in China and in the US. But I would suspect, knowing what we know about Western intelligence services and the way they operate, the 9/11 attacks, the bombings of Bologna railway station in 1980, the open threats that were made to the Chinese, we're not going to tolerate you anymore. We're going to cut you down to size. The whole debate that goes on, if you can call it that, in the mainstream academic and military circles in the US about China as a threat and how they've got to be dealt with, how we've got to get on top of the situation. So I would actually argue that it's quite likely that it's not an accidental leak, that it's a leak that was carried out deliberately by Western intelligence services because they got their people on the inside in the virology lab, which is why, of course, they've all been taken away for interrogation by the Chinese intelligence services. But the Chinese don't really want to go down the road of saying this was a deliberate attack on us, just as the Russians aren't talking about what happened in Moscow in 1999. They know that it was carried out by the Western intelligence services. They don't want to go down that road because once you go down that road, you go into war, and they don't want to go to war. So there's some things that people aren't going to find out everything about. But there's too many things that fit together here, isn't there?
There certainly are, and I think Rupert Murdoch, I hate to say this, needs a big pat on the back for his Fox News Corporation doing such an excellent report. You know, what I was reminded of was the Carl Cameron reports around the time of the September the 11th attacks, Martin, looking at the Israeli Comverse firm having hacked into the telephone records in the United States and were basically following the FBI around. And as the FBI was investigating the Israeli mafia activities in the United States, so they were being the mafia people were being warned by the Israeli intelligence people, saying, well, look, these FBI guys are onto you, so they would change their numbers, change their addresses, change their identities and all this sort of thing. And it's a very a brave sort of report to do. This one particularly, obviously they've done this over several weeks. So we've got Xi Zhengli, Batwoman, and Peter Daszak is Batman. and the whole Bat thing seems to me to be a cover, really, trying to make out that this is all a natural thing coming from bats, where actually it's been something that's been cooked up in the lab using bat viruses. This is something called a Chimera virus, which is created from various viruses from different species, which can then spread into humans.
Yeah. And it may be, I mean, logically, it may just be an accidental leak from the lab. I would argue that you shouldn't be carrying out gain-of-function research at all. It's clearly biological warfare research. That's all it is.
It certainly is.
I mean, if you're making natural viruses more transmissible and more dangerous, that's biological warfare research. And it's DARPA that funded all this, part of the Pentagon.
In order to kind of kick off a Third World War, this is the sort of thing that might actually do it if the truth came out straight away, for example. If, say, for example, we discovered that in Britain that a biological weapon had definitely been deliberately planted by China in the UK, I mean, that's an act of war. And actually, if this is a deliberate thing, obviously Peter Daszak is trying to do everything he possibly can to convince the whole world that it was all a terrible accident, and all he was doing was looking into the possibility of this sort of thing happening. But he cannot wriggle out of the fact that he was deliberately creating these viruses in this lab, which could go from species to species with gain of function. And also, of course, gain of function doesn't just mean species to species. It also means potentially adding extra things into that virus, such as, the spike protein for SARS, which would make it look like it was a normal flu, and it would behave a bit like pneumonia. Only thing is, if you tried treating that disease as if it was pneumonia, people would die, because you needed to be treating them for SARS, not for pneumonia, and it's a different treatment. So, there's also a lot of people saying that there is an AIDS spike protein also, and I don't imagine that the bats in the bat cave would have an AIDS virus. So, I think what's going on here, Martin, is this is a massive provocation, where the United States, Dr. Fauci, the US deep state, has done its best to plant evidence of a bioweapon on the Chinese. It's like a kind of, they're basically trying to fit them up as biowarfare people, whereas actually it's the US and possibly the Brits too who are doing this biological research.
Yes, there's a further complication, which is that Fort Detrick, which is the equivalent, that's definitely a military lab, is based in Maryland, and that was closed down in the summer of 2019 for reasons which have not been disclosed. There's also evidence to suggest that the virus has been around for quite a bit longer than when it was identified in Wuhan. For example, in Barcelona, they've discovered that the sewage from previous, from earlier in the year had the virus in it. Now, what Larry Romanoff is suggesting, and you can read his stuff on Under Review, is that there was an accidental leak from Fort Detrick, and it was then running around inside the United States. There was going to be a whole consequence of that, and that this whole thing of making sure that the initial finding of the virus was in Wuhan is in order to make sure that the Chinese are then blamed. So, and of course, the fact that you've then got Murdoch press in Australia and Trump trying to point the finger at the Chinese, the whole thing of the Wuhan virus, etc. This all actually fitted very much with we've got to do something about the terrible Chinese Communist Party.
Isn't it interesting the way that this has now transpired, that this wasn't Chinese research going on here, it was Fauci-funded research, and I think Fox News have done a very, very good job in, I suppose, righting the wrongs that they were doing then in trying to make out that it was China behind all this. Well,
if it's deliberate, they'd want to. It may be just accidental. Let's just be logical here. But if it's deliberate, and to my mind, it was just so coincidentally devastating. It was just before Chinese New Year. Wuhan is right at the centre of the Chinese transport system. If they hadn't got on top of it quickly, it could have absolutely devastated their economy. And they'd say, well, they wouldn't have allowed it to come back into the United States. They would, because they needed another excuse to bail the banking system out. Because basically what's been going on behind the curtain while we've all been talking COVID, is that the bankers have been bailed out yet again using public resources.
fantastic cover for them, that's for sure. So anyway, congratulations, particularly to journalist of the decade, Steve Hilton, whose all of his work seems to have been hidden or disappeared off of the internet. There's one or two mentions of this story out there, but they've done a superb job. Well done, Fox News. And I hate to say this, but well done, Rupert Murdoch, for actually doing that. And now we're going to have a listen to a piece that came after that. It's just an excerpt from it, actually, which is in an interview with New York Post journalist Miranda Devine, who Peter then interviewed about this whole subject.
Dr. Fauci was the most vociferous in objecting to the ban on gain-of-function research. He loved gain-of-function research. He didn't think that it was dangerous, or he thought it was a risk worth taking. Clearly it's not. To be mucking around with these viruses and making them infective to humans when they're not in nature is dangerous. And it's striking that the two people who are the most pushing back the most on the lab leak theory are Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak. They both of them said that it didn't happen. And Peter Daszak is over there in China right now. He is the only American representative on the World Health Organization investigation into the source of that virus. Yes. And he doesn't want to go and investigate the Wuhan virology lab. He was over there in October of 2019, which is when we know that the virus first started percolating. That may have been just before or around the time that the virus escaped from the lab, if that's the way it happened. So, he is not being straight with the public when he talks about this as not being a possibility. And I think he really ought to not pretend that these viruses, that bat viruses just mutate so easily, and that he's telling us that millions of Chinese have got some sort of antibodies to bat viruses. Even his own research doesn't show that. So he's not being straight. There's quite a few questions that he needs to answer. He really should come on your show, as should Dr. Fauci, because at the moment there's a lot of really circumstantial evidence showing that they are trying to stop the world from finding out where this virus came from, and that's crucial.
I'm just applauding. Great journalism. Well done, guys. That's Miranda Devine there speaking to Steve Hilton on Fox News on the 31st of January. It's so lovely to see someone actually doing the job of journalists all over the world should really be doing in this horrific wave that's absolutely unprecedented, that's swept across the world and affected so many millions of people in so many ways, destroyed livelihoods, killed probably hundreds of thousands of people. This guy needs to be arrested. This guy needs to be interviewed. This guy should possibly be jailed for what he's done. And we certainly need to make sure that he's not allowed to divert the investigation into the areas down caves and things away from. I mean, obviously, he did visit the Wuhan Institute, but he's there to have cups of tea, maybe Chinese tea, with, his various chums, his pals, like Xi Jinping. This is ridiculous, Martin, that we've got this guy is actually hiding in plain sight, isn't he? He's right in the forefront of the investigation, and yet he's the prime suspect in this massive pandemic.
Well, I take on board everything that's been said here, but I'm basically cynical, and I think they may have been deliberately leaking this virus, not just accidentally leaking it. And then that's what, if they're working closely with the deep state in the US, they will know that they're going to be protected. And it's also in the interest of the Chinese to keep it under wraps. If you were the Chinese intelligence services, you would know all of this, but you wouldn't say anything. You'd just say, we're not going to get mad, we're going to get even.
For thinking these things, maybe we should both be sent to re-education camps over here somewhere. Anyway, our final piece is another one on Peter Daszak, and he was actually on the BBC World Service, would you believe, last night, talking to Roland Pease, who, of course, didn't ask him any useful questions. He just kind of he's massaging Peter Daszak as if he's a super pal of him sitting on his knee. And even though he's the prime suspect in the COVID pandemic, he is just giving him a nice, easy time and treating him like a little fluffy puppy dog. So that's the sort of thing you expect, I'm afraid, from professional journalists at the BBC World Service nowadays. So let's have a listen now to Roland Pease's interview last night, or a part of it, short part of it. It's just about 3 minutes long, with the man who butter wouldn't melt in his mouth, Peter Daszak, prime suspect in the COVID pandemic.
On the WHO team was Peter Daszak, who's worked closely with Chinese virologists in the past and who's been on Science in Action several times this past year. And he briefed me on that work just before he caught his flight home.
What they've done since the outbreak is they've been round to livestock farms, they've been to farms that breed domesticated wildlife, and they've been out in the field catching animals, and they've even been to zoos. So they've got a wide diversity of species they've looked at over a large geographic space in China. But China's a big country and there's a lot of stuff to do. It's by no means an exhaustive sample, but it is really good work. It's I think, I can't remember the total, but it's in the order of 100,000 samples and tests. Add to that 900 plus samples from the Huanan seafood market, environmental plus animal samples. They've done a lot of work, without a doubt. And we saw those data. I think we were the first people outside China to see those data. So they've done work that was exactly in the terms of reference for the WHO joint study, as they call it.
How did they target? This is one of the things I was trying to work out. How did they target which animals to go to, which areas to go to? Was this related to records, for example, that they found at the Huanan seafood market?
Some of it was. And some of it was opportunistic, and some of it was digging up serological samples from livestock collections, which every country collects, and any country can go and look at archive specimens. So they've done that as well. But the targeting of samples from the Huanan is what I'm most interested in. I think you're exactly right. What needs to be done is a trace back from the Huanan seafood market. So they have done some of that. They've found the supplies to the market. They've tried to find as many as they could. They've got the names of the farms and the people who run them, and they've been to some, but they've not been to all, and some of them are quite interesting, including the ones from regions of China that have viruses that are closely related to SARS-CoV-2 in southern China. So that's of interest to us on the WHO side, and that needs to be followed up. And then also, when you think of supply chains of wildlife, once you get down to southern China, you're on the border of Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar. And, those of us who work there know full well that animals move across that border, or used to. It's probably cracked down a lot this year. So it would be interesting to trace back to those farms, the contacts of those farmers. Were they getting supplies from other places? Could it have gone into other countries? Because as we know more and more about these bat viruses, we're seeing an increasing diversity from Southeast Asia, and I think that might be a source of related viruses that needs to be looked at. There's been undersampled region right there.
Hey, Peter, what about the lab? Never mind 1,000 miles away in Laos. What the hell are you doing down there, looking for stupid bats and pangolins? Whereas actually you brought those samples back into the lab, and you were making chimera viruses. We know that now. Anyway, so there is the absolutely unbelievably audacious Mr. Chutzpah, and his name is Dr. Peter Daszak. He's a zoologist, he's a Brit, and he went to university in Wales, and he's now at the World Health Organization. Martin, the World Health Organization, of course, the main funder of that is Bill Gates. This is the world we're moving into, which is a privatized version of the United Nations, where the international regulators, the international authorities are basically privatized, and they're staffed with a stable of scientists and professionals of various different sorts who are there because they go along with a specific line, and they're basically there as part of a revolving doors with the industry. So the most incredible thing, I suppose, about this little investigation that we've put together tonight with the help of Fox and the rest of them is that this guy has got the cheek to go on explaining how he's looking all over the place for the natural origin of the virus. Well, actually, we suspect, and in fact, it looks highly likely, far more likely, that it's been created in the lab.
Yeah, well, when you say Bill Gates is the biggest funder of the WHO, but now that Biden has put the US back in the WHO, he will be, the amount of money going in will be, the US was the biggest funder of it. And then, of course, Trump took them out, and that then made Bill Gates the second biggest funder. Problem
here with the WHO, it's not just the funding from the US government or from, proper elected governments rather than private foundations. It's also the fact that you've got the World Health Organization now part of the UN, which is in a partnership agreement with the World Economic Forum, with Klaus Schwab and his great resetters. So it's actually the international regulatory infrastructure of the planet is being privatized.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's happening is because the UN is being starved of resources by the US. It's been basically domesticated by the US. We've seen this with the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, where the people on the ground in Syria were pretty much convinced that there hadn't been a chemical weapons attack at Douma, and that it was basically a faked attack by the white helmets who were funded by British taxpayers, basically. And on the back of that, Theresa May then had us firing missiles into Syria, which of course could have led to the Syrians firing back and killing loads of personnel at RAF Akrotiri. They didn't, but they might have done. And we've got people who are basically the idea that you see that when they had the World Economic Forum in Davos not long ago, both Putin and Xi.
Well, yeah, it was online. It was online only. It was an online version.
It was an online version. That's right. But I mean, but Xi Jinping and Putin both participated for the first time in ages. I mean, I think they've both been before, and they basically what the Chinese and the Russians they probably, if we can work this out, they've worked it out. Yeah, you can be pretty certain they know what's going on, and what they're doing is trying to deal with a completely rogue setup in the West. And, of course, it's pretty clear after 9/11 they must have realised what they're dealing with. But they don't just call it out and say, we know what you're up to, you evil so-and-sos, we're going to go to war with you. Because, of course, they don't want to go to war. They're trying to work out what the hell's going on, and they're trying to talk in a reasonable tone of voice at the same time as making their preparations to fight them.
Yeah, well, I think
that's where we're at.
Maybe they want to enslave people without going to war. At least this is something that has come out in the West, in Fox News. We've got a freer press here in the West than they have in China, haven't we? I mean,
yes.
China, anything like this would be absolutely...
Well, exactly. So the Chinese system is therefore vulnerable precisely because it is, a relatively closed system. And they therefore, I mean, what's happened today is that the Chinese have banned the BBC World Service from China because their version was banned by the British Ofcom last week when I was on RT talking about it. So the idea that because Putin and Xi Jinping participated in the World Economic Forum online, that they are part of the Great Reset is wrong, because basically Putin's speech was basically saying, we don't agree with a lot of what you're talking about, but I'm prepared to talk to you about it. And you can understand why, that from their point of view, they don't want to open this can of worms unless a real shooting war starts, in which case they will dump all this stuff on they must have lots of intelligence about it. They can dump it all on the internet.
I think, you could probably say the same about the September the 11th attacks as well,
Yeah, they must know. If we can work out what's going on, you can be sure they can. And the idea that they're all in on it together, I think is wrong. Some people think that it's all a plot by all of them. I don't think it is. I think that the basic antagonisms that are still there, and it's a game of bluff, double bluff, and
for me, Martin, I take a different view to you, which is that if you haven't got a free press in a country, if you haven't got rights of freedom of speech without being destroyed, arrested, or whatever, then it's not worth having any of this stuff, because a free press, and we've seen through the treatment of Julian Assange particularly, that we actually don't really have a free press anymore in the West, that when he has been reporting on absolutely horrific and horrendous crimes by our secret services here in the West. He's been just locked up, actually, for just simply doing his job as a journalist. And that's the sort of thing, I think, which we've really got to stop in the West. Otherwise, basically, that's it. We're going to into the world of utter darkness. So we're going to go now and have a look and actually hear from Denise Woods. She's a local expert, medical expert, who's worked in certainly in the